This was a search for the truth wherever it lay.
He'd never admitted any responsibility.
Here was a man who would kill for nothing.
He had no emotion, a cold, callous, distasteful individual.
I'm sorry if you've got that opinion, but you're totally wrong.
There was a real potential that he would kill again. My name is Steve Wilkins. I'm a former Detective Chief Superintendent in Dyfed-Powys Police. During the 80s, within this very small area of North Pembrokeshire, there was really a blip on the landscape in relation to serious criminality. Within a distance of no more than 5 miles, we had 2 double murders. And then in 1996, 5 children were indecently assaulted by a man with a balaclava and a double-barrel sawn-off shotgun. A number of lines of inquiry were undertaken, but those offences remained undetected. It was like the elephant in the room, which people didn't really want to talk about, and that was very unacceptable. I believe the evidence is always there. It's just having the people with the will to find it. For me, it's about the search for the truth. A couple of people who were travelling home one evening noticed that there was plumes of smoke crossing the road. The Scoverson Park farm was well ablaze.
News on the hour. Police have revealed more shocking news on the deaths of millionaire landowners Helen and Richard Thomas. Initial suspicion that the siblings had died in a murder-suicide pact have been discounted. Since recovering their bodies from the fire, police have discovered shotgun injuries that could not have been self-inflicted. More on that as the story unfolds.
Helen Thomas was alone in the house during the evening time. Her brother Richard was out at Knowlton Farm. What we believed was likely to happen was that Richard came back, the house was ablaze. His sister had already been attacked and shot while she was in the house. In an outhouse not far away from the main building, there was probably a struggle between him and the offender with the gun, and then the gun has gone off. Richard's body is then dragged back into the house onto a half landing, and his body is left there. Helen's body is recovered on the ground floor, but she's actually lying on top of bed springs, and what we think happened is that she's attacked in an upper floor, probably a bedroom, and during the fire, the floors are burnt out and the body on top of the bed springs has dropped through to the ground floor.
The damage was quite significant, which made it difficult to determine whether anything of value had been taken from the house.
There was a substantial search of the house by the officers in the investigation, and at no stage did they find a firearm or indeed any spent cartridges. So it was quite clear that the offender had taken the firearm and spent cartridges away from the scene.
Today's headlines. The bodies of missing holidaymakers, husband and wife Peter and Gwenda Dixon, have been found gunned down on a coastal path. Their brutal deaths have shocked the local community.
Peter and Gwenda Dixon, a couple from Oxfordshire. They used to visit Pembrokeshire regularly. They loved the area. They were well known in the area. On the 29th of June 1989, they went for a walk along the coastal path. At At this stage, they were attacked.
Peter was tied up with rope. There was evidence that Gwenda had been sexually assaulted by the offender.
Witnesses who were actually down here in the bay on the beach, they heard 5 shots.
Both had received gunshot wounds. The offender had tried to cover his tracks by covering the bodies in branches.
Horrifying event, and quite clear that one of them had to watch their loved one murdered in front of them before the hopeless expectation that they were going to meet the same fate.
Their property was strewn around the area. Again, what was clear was that there were items of value missing from the couple, their wallet and cash card.
Following morning, Peter Dixon's cash card was used. The offender had used this particular cash point at 14 minutes past 7 in the morning. A witness who was passing that moment in time, their attention was drawn to somebody that was using the cash point of what was described as the wild man, unkempt hair, unshaven, and he was wearing a pair of knee-length khaki shorts. We're now at the location of the Milford Haven attack. If we look across the field, you'll see that the field slopes away to the far end to my right. It was in this field that 5 children were playing. They were then confronted by a masked man, balaclava, brandishing a sawn-off shotgun. He made them lie on the ground. He hit the boys around the head with his sawn-off shotgun. He then selected one of the girls and took her away from the group, where he raped her. Brought her back to the group, took another female away, and indecently assaulted her. For me, it's an offence which was equally as shocking as the 2 double murders, because those children, without doubt, had their childhood taken away from them on that evening in 1996.
Chief Superintendent Steve Welkin has successfully been granted permission by superiors to reopen Pembrokeshire's most brutal and harrowing unsolved cold case crimes.
I was aware that nationally there had been some success in cold case reviews. And after discussions then with the then head of CID, Steve Mears, and chief officers, we all agreed that that must be a priority, and I set about very quickly was to put together a plan for us to actually start the review of 3 major detected crimes. We had 2 double murders, a rape, an indecent assault. Our investigation was then codenamed Operation Ottawa. There's no greater responsibility placed on a human being than to investigate the circumstances of the death of another human being. And we need to carry out that without fear, without favour, but also without prejudice as well. Because if we don't, then we've got no right in representing the victims. So I wanted to be very, very clear that this was a search for the truth wherever it lay. Once I'd actually started to look at the offences, started to draw links between them, the method of offending bore strong similarities. Multiple victims, double-barrel shotgun, robbery, a sexual element.
All this information put together resulted in determining that it was a single person who was committing these offences.
Was one individual, and we need to actually identify a suspect. I really started to review our response in relation to serious crime. And what was clear is that we didn't have a dedicated team, a major crime team, with the training and with the capability of reviewing the undetected crimes. I'd already identified that I need people that I could trust, a team that would pay attention to detail, officers that I'd put against any in the UK. Glyn Johnson was also somebody I knew that would concentrate on details. He was very good in relation to IT. And I know that he'd be an essential part of the team because of his can-do attitude.
Coming into the force, bringing my family down into this area, it was certainly concerning for me that there were two undetected, very nasty murders that had taken place, all not too far away from where I was actually living. So I was approached by Steve Wilkins, who made me aware that the force was doing a cold case review. I saw that as a golden opportunity to bring a dangerous person to justice, and of course, I took it.
Our first challenge was to identify a location away from any police building, somewhere where we could carry on with the actual investigation and not be disturbed. I also was very keen on keeping the investigation covert at that moment in time. We found some offices which are up at Fishguard. They were occupied by the Coast Guard and the Port Authority. I made this journey on hundreds of occasions on my way to visit the team, and it's exactly that same feeling. I can feel my pulse starting to race, I can feel that adrenaline, and it just makes me feel like I did, 15, 20 years ago. It's quite spooky. Just hasn't changed at all, has it?
It doesn't.
Yeah.
It hasn't changed a bit. It's been 15 years since I last came down.
I think a concern for me was that isolation.
It was quite significant as it was 12 miles away from the station that I was working in. I hadn't had any contact with my colleagues in Haverfordwest at that time. It was lonely times, just included spending long times away from home, but we knew we got a job to do.
It's quite mixed emotions when I actually look at the place there now, because this is where it started. I can remember the first days when we went into a very dark and very unwelcoming building, and how quickly we turned it into a functioning incident room. Photographs around the walls, photographs of the bodies, and very, very violent scenes. The MO of the unresolved murders and sexual assaults indicated it was one perpetrator, and more than likely local to the area. So we began to review historic cases, looking for a pattern that might connect to other crimes. During the 90s, there was the spate of dwelling house burglaries. Lots of the houses around here were attacked, lots of burglaries took place, cash and jewellery stolen. And they seem to have a very similar method of offending to the undetected crimes that we had.
The offender using a shotgun, and the offender would also have a balaclava.
The offender would approach by fields, would cut fences, single females alone in houses. He tied them up and then subjected them to quite disproportionate violence, until he actually made a significant mistake. During a particular nasty armed robbery, the victim managed to activate a panic alarm in the house, which caused him to flee across the fields. And whilst doing so, started to get rid of items of his offending. A suspect been identified, and when you looked at the burglaries mapped out and plotted and presented evidentially, it was like looking at a bicycle wheel, and right in the epicentre of that bicycle wheel was his house. The hedgerows which came away from the house, they found jewellery, gloves, a balaclava, and in particular a sawn-off shotgun.
Sufficient evidence to put him into prison.
He was a man called John William Cooper.
A Swansea Crown Court jury has sentenced Pembrokeshire resident John William Cooper to 16 years imprisonment for a series of violent armed robberies over more than a decade.
He was a dangerous, controlling individual.
His son painted a picture of this man who was both verbally abusive, physically abusive. He would beat him. He threatened him with a firearm. We know that he had a significant gambling habits.
He was a keen darts player, and there was a story out there that one night after a darts match, and he'd lost a darts match, that he'd fallen out with the guy that he was playing darts with, and they went outside and he beat him up.
Locally, people would give him a wide berth.
Again, there was only circumstantial evidence with regards to the potential involvement in the murders.
John William Cooper had been identified as a person of significant interest for the undetected murders and the sexual assault.
On the conviction of him for the burglaries and robberies, we knew that at some stage he would be coming out of prison, and that put extra responsibility on us. And the forming of Ottawa in 2006, we knew that he was coming out of prison about 2008, so yeah, huge challenge.
It was time for us to carry out a fundamental thematic forensic review, and that would involve looking at all of the material, all of the evidence, the physical evidence in relation to those offences. For Ottawa was the sheer size of it. We had thousands of exhibits to retrieve. Then we start to prioritise those exhibits which I know had either been touched by the offender, brought to the scene by the offender, or had come into contact with the victims. Evidence that would connect an offender to the offences itself. One sock which was recovered from the body of Richard Thomas was almost intact. There was also rope which was found, which was tied round Helen Thomas. Clearly what we'd be looking for was DNA, linking John William Cooper to the undetected crimes that we had at that moment in time.
We were pretty much restricted to DNA profiling, at least in the first instance. Very, very focused and painstaking.
One significant piece of evidence was a pair of khaki shorts which were recovered from John Cooper's house. And though they bore a resemblance to those of the wild man used in the cash point in Haverfordwest, they were significantly shorter. What we did know is that John Cooper's wife was a seamstress. Those shorts were initially examined for DNA.
Our relationship with Stephen and the team was very good to start with, but it took a bit of a knock when it was becoming obvious that we were not getting the sort of DNA results that I think we'd all hoped for.
We were getting very little sort of feedback in relation to any sort of connectivity or any results. The forensic evidence was so degraded that there was no real readable results coming from it.
To say that we were slightly disheartened, I would say, was probably an understatement at that time.
Watching the frustration of the team when we didn't seem to have the luck going in our direction, particularly the lack of sort of forensic hits, the golden nuggets as I used to call it. That was a particular low time. the undetected crimes at that stage. Nobody had actually sat across the table and put the offences towards John William Cooper, so I decided at that stage that we would actually get him out of prison and interview him around elements of his offending history, the fact that he used firearms, the fact that he used rope, and perhaps persuade him to confess to what he had done. He may have a pang of guilt and decide that he wants to tell us everything.
I interviewed John Cooper about 8 times during the initial stage when we're doing a lot of background questioning. There's no doubt in my mind that these interviews are certainly the most challenging and important that I've ever experienced in my 30-year policing career. Leading up to the first interview, I'd never met him before. He walked past me, stopped, and in a nasty type of menacing type of way, he turned to me and said, "Have I met you before?" I said, "No, I don't think so. I'm glad about that." The only thing I can equate is that when you see a middleweight boxer and they had that steely stare with no emotion or anything, when he was walking in there, he was going into that interview room on a mission and he had no emotion, a cold, callous, distasteful individual. It's very difficult sitting next to somebody, particularly with these horrendous offences and the type of the things that the victims have gone through.
We started talking about the tools of his offending.
We'll talk about ropes, because ropes were used in a number of the offences, particularly the double murder offences. John Cooper said that, yes, he had ropes, and he had it on his boat, and he used to go down Little Haven fishing. But sometimes, he'd lost a lot of ropes, and people would come and steal ropes. So I think he was making us believe, well, if any of the ropes are linked to me, they could have been ones which have been washed off, or I've lost from my boat, or they've been stolen. The same with the balaclava. And he said, yes, I had a balaclava on my boat, and it was stolen from me. So if there's any forensic link, somebody's stolen my balaclava, I haven't been involved in the offence.
Cooper was a very clever person with regards to second-guessing where the questions were coming from. He would wait to see where the evidence was coming from, and then he would come up with an answer to try and curve that.
I believe that you're responsible for the murder of Gwenda and Peter Dixon.
All I can say is I'm sorry if you've got that opinion, but you're totally wrong.
That interview didn't bring any confessions from Cooper.
He'd never admitted any responsibility.
We knew that he was coming to the end of his sentence. That was probably, for me, the most concerning part of the investigation, was once that Cooper had been released on parole. I actually also used that as a lever in relation to justifying why we should carry on with Operation Ottawa, because the reputation of the force, the safety of the community was at risk. The real possibility of him coming out and offending before we had the chance to charge him was significant. And that came with its own problems, because it's very difficult then to carry out any sort of surveillance on him as an offender, because his offending with a firearm going across fields. So to try and do any sort of surveillance, you would also be putting officers at risk, not only the local community. I wanted to ensure that we kept him in for as long as we could. I made personal appeals to the governor of the prison. That didn't go particularly well, because all that happened was that the prison recategorised him as a Category A offender, which made it more difficult for me to have access to him. So these were different pressures.
John William Cooper has today been released after serving 10 years of his 16-year sentence.
We were aware that Cooper was a very dangerous man.
There was a real potential that he would kill again.
It became a ticking bomb. Our QC, our barrister, Gerard Elias, came on board during that period as well.
I was the senior prosecutor, QC, and of course helped the police with the investigation from a very early stage. And I said, look, If this is the best we've got, circumstantial evidence, it's a pretty strong circumstantial evidence case, by which I mean there's a better, not much, but there's a better than 50% chance we shall succeed in a prosecution. I spoke with the team and they showed me the locations. It became even smaller as a part of the world, if you like. And so my feeling that there was just about a circumstantial evidence case was helped by seeing the geography, seeing the places. You know, some of these places could only have been attacked by somebody who knew the area. The place where the body was found off the coastal path. Somebody had to know that. It wasn't an accident that the attacker took them there. He obviously knew that that place existed. With the Scotherstone Park murder, you know, the fire was set by accelerant, paraffin, as I recall it. There was a tank of paraffin alongside the house, but who knew that? Not your random robber, but it was somebody who had a fairly intimate knowledge of the property, because he put the accelerant on, and how did he know that? Because, of course, he'd been there before, because he'd worked for them. And so these things, you know, were building together. I make no bones about it, that we had the right man. But my view was that until you've got the thumbprint, the golden nugget, the bit that says that is him, sometimes the jury will say you haven't got the absolute certainty.
But really, we were absolutely convinced that at some stage that we would find the truth, we'd find that golden nugget, linking John William Cooper to the offences. I was aware that nationally there had been some success in looking back at historic offences, and in particular the advances in forensic science had now given us a real fighting chance to re-examine some of those offences and to bring modern-day science to bear on them.
We tried to be as imaginative as possible about the way in which we came at some of these items. We were in this kind of DNA straitjacket, so we had suggested, why don't we look a little bit wider? One of the things that we found had been really useful, and that is textile fibres, because the victims were wearing clothing. The offender, I'm sure, was wearing clothing. There had been contact between them, and this gives us another kind of evidence to look for.
When we actually started to look for fibres, this is a different process. The forensic evidence would either take us towards John William Cooper, or it would take us to identify another offender.
One main new technique with a higher power microscope, that just gives you better discrimination about the colour of fibres and being able to compare them. It was a game changer in fibre examinations. It can provide incredibly powerful evidence of contact in their own right. Now suddenly, we started finding stuff. It was amazing. Even I was amazed.
You had fibres going from Cooper's house to these offences. You had fibres also from items found in the offences going back to Cooper's house.
His shed was searched, and sweepings were taken from the floor in his workbench. And in those sweepings were fibres which were linked to gloves which belonged to Cooper, and fibres from those were recovered on branches covering the bodies of the Dixons. They were recovered in the underwear of the rape victim from the Milford Haven attack.
The links from fibres were a huge part of that case. You know, beyond any possibility of coincidental transfer, similar fibres. The work they did was phenomenal. I mean, there isn't another word for it.
Shorts recovered from Cooper's home were re-examined.
And it was while looking for textile fibres that we noticed this tiny, tiny stain.
I was driving, and during that journey, my hands-free telephone went, and it was Angela Gallup, and she said, "Steve, are you driving?" And I said, "Yes."
We found your golden nugget.
"I think you need to pull over." I managed to pull into a lay-by, and she said, "Steve."
We found this tiny flake of what looked like blood.
It was indeed my golden nugget.
We profiled that and came up with a match for Peter Dixon's DNA.
And I said, Angela, I love you. From that moment, we had the first DNA link. After that came out the sawn-off shotgun, which Cooper had used during the robberies for which he was convicted. It had been tested for DNA, it'd been taken to pieces, it'd been swabbed. But we had noticed that there was black Hammerite paint on the barrel. There was another high-profile case with Lynette White where paint was removed from skirting boards, which had been successful. So we asked them to do that.
So we tested them and got a DNA profiling result that also matched the DNA of Peter Dixon.
Which meant at that stage we then identified the murder weapon. I put together then the arrest team to go and arrest him whilst he was on his morning walk. It was quite a funny moment because he basically threw the officers around like rag dolls.
He later on went to say that he didn't know we were police officers and he thought that he was getting beaten up in the street. He was still a very, very strong guy. We sat him in the back of the car, and that was probably one of the longest journeys and most quietest journeys I've ever been on, to be honest.
OK, we're now approaching, on this journey, another significant location, and that's Haverfordwest Police Station. This is the location where we conducted the second interview with Cooper, having secured the very damning forensic evidence against him.
During the second series of interviews, when he was arrested, he became aware that the forensic evidence was stacking up on him. He had nowhere to go. He was back against the wall. He couldn't give any explanation as to how Peter Dixon's blood was on those shorts and shotgun. And I think then he realised he was really in trouble and that the true Cooper was coming out.
You're making things try to fit to John Cooper, and it's bloody annoying.
We got this forensic evidence, it all comes back.
You know, as a young lady, I once said, I've tried to put you and give you information that you can check.
He blurted out, oh, you're all thinking it's all about John Cooper. You in here and them in there, pointed at the camera.
You and your colleagues and them in there choose not to believe it.
And you could see he wanted to erupt at that point. He knew the cards were against him and he was going to face a trial in Crown Court.
John William Cooper, convicted for a spate of violent armed robberies in the 90s and released in 2008, now stands accused of 2 double murders and the attack and indecent assault of 5 teenagers. He arrived at Swansea Crown Court to face trial today. The allegations are the result of a historic cold case review, investigating crimes spanning as far back as 1985.
Judge me after the trial, not before. Judge me after the trial.
It's quite a strange position to be in. You've just controlled an investigation for 6 years. The judges put that in the hands of 12 people from the community to listen to the evidence. So from total control, you have no control.
The geography was hugely important. We had all that wonderful evidence of how the paths, sometimes through thickets, sometimes through barbed wire fences which had been snipped, how all those paths in the end found their way back to one place, which happened to be the place where Mr. Cooper was living at the time. When the defense were asking questions, they spent the whole of the day really not dealing with much of the evidence, except for him to say, no, I didn't kill the Dixons, I wasn't involved in Scotterton, and I wasn't the person in the field. I mean, that was really his defense, okay, without going into too much more detail. And the jury were even playing a video of his daughter's wedding, where he was giving her away, where he was making speeches. The impression being given, despite all the prosecution say, this is actually a decent family man. Would he have done any of these nonsensical things that they're talking about? And so at 4 o'clock, When the defence sat down, I didn't want the jury left with this idea that he was really just a family man who we might all have misunderstood, and, you know, the evidence was being doctored against him and so on. So I thought, I'll just take one point. And the one point, of course, was what he'd said about a balaclava.
He said, is it not true that in your previous trial for robbery, you said the discarded balaclava did not belong to you? But in this trial, because your head hair has been found in it, you're now saying that that balaclava does belong to you, but it must have been stolen off your boat.
So I simply spent 10 minutes trying to get him to say, you did lie to that previous jury, didn't you? But in the end, of course, he has to say, yes, I lied to the previous jury about a very important exhibit. Thank you very much, my lord. That'll be a convenient moment. And I think, you know, so the jury were not going home thinking, oh, yeah, this is a man who actually, you know, makes it up on the hoof. And of course, he doesn't want to tell the truth even now,
It was just the cool, calculated way that Mr. Elias operated.
For me, it was a stroke of pure genius. The next morning, Mr. Elias looked at the jury and said,
I want to tell you a story, members of the jury, and the story really is in 3 parts. The first part is this. You know, in 1985, this happened. In 1989, that happened. And in 1996, this happened. Horrific offences. This was the evil man who had answers for almost everything. The man who would go out with a gun in the evenings, and if there was a chance of a burglary, he'd take it. And if he met somebody, he'd execute. Here was a man who would kill for nothing.
The artist's impression of the person believed to be using the Dixon's cash card showed the side profile of the potential offender with a massive curly hair, unshaven. During the robberies inquiry, Cooper didn't look nothing like the artist's impression. However, it became apparent to us during the Ottawa investigation that Cooper had been on television on Bullseye in 1989. We were fortunate enough then to get a side profile shot of Cooper from the television company.
I mean, I remember the first time I saw it, you know, you said, good Lord, that's an amazing artist impression.
It was almost like they'd done an artist's impression of him on Bullseye.
It was as good as you could get, really, short of a photograph. And it was phenomenal, but of course the impact. It was like some of the big moments in the trial where you realised the jury knew that this wasn't some coincidence that put the defendant there. He was there because that was him.
We'd look at the exhibits that we got, Scoverston, Dixon's, Milford Haven, and the robberies.
The locations.
And rope.
The victim's blood.
Cut fences. DNA link.
Fibres.
From gloves.
Leading to Cooper's house.
Those fibres matched. The blood found underneath the paint on the shotgun, and indeed the blood on the shorts, would go to the Coastal Path murder.
He kept the shorts, which were later identified as belonging to Gwenda Dixon, for years and years after he had murdered them. Why did he do that? And it was quite clear that he wore those shorts. Was it because when he put them on, it put him mentally back in that time when he had control of those people?
The son's evidence late on in the trial that his father would go out at dusk with the dog and with the gun. You know, I mean, how important was that in relation to putting him in the field with the youngsters? The girls themselves gave evidence very bravely and very well indeed, very, very bravely. It was a big moment. It was huge.
After more than 7 weeks, both legal teams involved in the trial of John William Cooper have finished giving evidence, and jurors will be expected to come to a verdict.
If the investigation failed and he was given his freedom, I would take responsibility. I had already written out my resignation.
I had this It's a rather panicky feeling when you're making a closing speech and you think the jury are perhaps not listening to you anymore.
We spent every day waiting and hoping that the verdict would shortly be released.
This is a very tense time because nobody ever knows what the verdict a jury is going to give.
People start to look at, how long has the jury been out? Why are they taking so long to come to a decision?
I don't care how long you've been doing it. It's in the hands of the jury at the end of the day, and you never know.
The victims of the Milford Haven attack were actually in a one-way glass room next to the court. They could see into the court. When the first verdict came back and he said the word guilty to that one, I turned to Glyn Johnson and I said, it's a full house.
Guilty of the murders of Helen and Richard Thomas, guilty of Peter and Gwenda Dixon's murders, guilty of the rapes of the two girls in Milford Haven.
Cooper never said a word until the verdict for rape. He then exploded in the court and started to shout at the court.
Here we had a man convicted of 4 murders, and now rape. He knew that was going to put him into prison where nobody would have the remotest bit of sympathy for him. Now he's going to be a marked man.
It was fabulous to know the person responsible for these terrible, heinous crimes was now going to spend the rest of their life behind bars.
We looked at each other and said, that's it then. It's done. It's finished.
There was a cloud on the area, and I think with the Crown Court verdict, it gave closure.
And I always remember one message which I received from somebody who said that they hadn't walked the coastal path for 20 years and that they were going to walk it that weekend. Suddenly this dark cloud had been lifted over the top of that part of Wales and Pembrokeshire.
It probably was the biggest case that I was involved in. In terms of criminal trials, this was a remarkable case. I mean, it was remarkable because of its age, because of the investigation that had to be carried out against that background. When we're going back 20 and 30 years. And I would agree entirely that it is, in all probability, the greatest cold case review and result that there has been.
I am very proud that we were able to represent the victims and their families and for them to see justice done.
Judge Griffith-Williams gave him life means life, which to my mind was an inevitability, because here you were talking about a dangerous psychopath. Given the opportunity to kill for next to nothing, he'd do it again, I have little doubt.
For me, it was around achieving justice, about finding the truth, about making sure that those victims of John Cooper had their day in court and had justice and had an opportunity to try as best they could to move on.
The young people, they were obviously frightened out of their lives by what happened to them, and their evidence undoubtedly contributed to the conviction. There was family of the Thomases, and I met them during the trial. I met the son and daughter of the Dixons. They go down every year to lay flowers at the point where their parents were killed, and they've maintained the memory of their parents. They're good people, and of course they went through hell because of the events and the impact it had on their own families. So all of them, in a way, have played a really important part in ensuring that John Cooper will not see the light of day again.
Searching the truth is very important. It's very important not to get carried away, but just to look at what evidence you've got. It was a very long journey over several years.
Those 5 years were a long 5 years.
And for the families of the victims, it was a tremendously long journey, which they're still on.
Some of these officers worked on that investigation For 5 years, they were totally dedicated to it. Surrounded by misery, by mayhem, by murder. Then to go home and to be a father, to be a brother, to be a husband for families is sometimes very, very difficult.
So you certainly had to deal with it yourself. I think all of us suffered.
I spent a significant amount of time away from home. Very soon after the court case, I separated from my then wife, which obviously caused significant issues at home with my children. John Cooper had an impact on all of us. The way he went about his offending, I think he enjoyed what he did. I think he got some sort of sexual satisfaction about what he did and controlling people. But I just think the man was just born evil. On a quiet moment, I will sit and I'll look at the things we did. I'll reflect on other parts of my policing career. And fortunately or unfortunately, you know, I've had that opportunity to see people at their very best, but also see people at their very, very worst. And I don't think you'd be human if that didn't have some sort of lasting impact on you as an individual. And I know I'd probably speak on behalf of the rest of the team, is that we have all had issues in different ways. And, you know, that's a consequence of being a detective, consequence of being a cop.
Cracking cold cases. Stream the new series of hit crime drama Unforgotten on ITVX. And that's also where you can find classic noughties comedy starring Zach Braff. That's Scrubs. But next, the latest stories with the ITV News at 10.